we just finished the sesquicentennial, didn't we? And I don't know if you saw on television, the surrender of Lee was on the History Channel, not the 40 channel, but the one high up. And that was at Appomattox. They celebrated it a week ago Saturday, and there were crowds as all of those people arrived in their period costumes and went on in to the house. And so we do know that we have had a good sesquicentennial. In this month of April 1865, 150 years ago, boys were coming home to Madison County from the Civil War. Though the 34th Indiana from here was not mustered out until 1866, which you probably all know. The bicentennial finished, but these soldiers were coming home quietly. They tried to rejoin a state which was on the move into becoming an industrial society. Anderson itself was becoming an industrial town with several new industries. Mostly the people returning would become farmers, but there were new opportunities. The gas boom was coming, the glass boom was coming in the 1880s and 90s. Of the thousands of soldiers coming home to Indiana, some were still ill and suffering from battlefield stress that would never leave them. I was informed of this in a lot of detail in that book we did a couple of years ago called 500 Strong, Wabash College soldiers in the Civil War. 500 men went from Wabash College, which was the highest total in the country as far as the student body percentage went, and really almost matched Harvard and Princeton. And the secret of it is that they had an academy there also, so they had many people who had graduated and boys, and they all went, some of them together actually. And I was able to see in there the individual biographies of these 500 guys are in there. And researched by the students, the seniors at Wabash College through several years. It was amazing how many people came back and then suffered from effects from the war all the rest of their lives, or died within a couple of years of malaria that was lingering, or dysentery that had eaten up their stomachs, or all the rest of the things that happened. So the casualties went on after the war too. They were in the Mississippi Valley, after all, many of them, or they were in the swamp, Blackwater Swamp in Virginia. Those who survived came back and gladly rejoined their families. They took up their tasks and built for the future the beginnings of the modern nation we know today. They loved their comrades from the battlefield days forever, and they went to them and went to reunions until their dying days. The 34th seems to have had reunions well into the 1920s. Now it's my task and pleasure to talk about a lesser-known part of the war, one that reflected not so much glory, that had no bands playing for it, no medals awarded. It was what the soldiers called fire in the rear, the anti-war movements that were strong all over this state. I sometimes thought that only southern Indiana experienced these, but some of the worst were just north of here in Huntington and all the way up to Fort Wayne. Every county in Indiana had Copperheads. Or they called themselves the Knights of the Golden Circle, the Sons of Liberty, the Peace Democrats in a slightly different vein, but they were all called Copperheads by the boys at the front and their families back home who hated and feared these opposing elements. Southern and northern Indiana were split to some extent in opinion before the war, and they remained split during the war, and the repercussions of the split of opinion remain with us to this day. I recall my own dad, who was born in 1897 and brought up in a farm in Knox County by his grandfather, who was a private in the 14th Indiana Regiment, telling the story of when he was a boy of about 5 or 6. The new telephone exchange had just come in Knox County, and it was, of course, a big party line, and you're familiar with those. And my dad's aunt Fanny, McClure, was 18 at the time, and she would get on the party line, and she would listen, and then she would make comments into the party line. And she would say, "Well, sissy, you don't say. I never heard of such a thing. What do you think of that?" And so the guy that ran the telephone exchange, whose name was Henry Baddeley, didn't like that very well. He got complaints from some of the ladies who were having their conversations overheard. So he came out to see Grandpa McClure, the veteran from the 14th, and he stood out there on the farm, and my dad, this little boy, was standing there watching. And so John McClure said, "Henry Baddeley, what are you here for?" And he said, "Well, now, John, Fanny has been getting on the party line, and she's been insulting some of the ladies by mocking them. Now, she has to quit doing this, or we're going to have to get rid of your phone." And so Grandpa McClure, according to my dad, said, "Henry Baddeley, you were just one of those gosh darn Copperheads, and you used to go out to the barn there outside of town, and you guys lit those torches and went in there and planned against us, and we're out there at Antietam and Gettysburg." And then he knocked him down. He tried to. And then Henry fought back, and these two old men were down wrestling on the ground, refighting the Civil War in front of this little boy, and that is the way it went for that whole generation until the last of those men were gone in the 50s. And their families felt the repercussions of the strain that was put on the home front here and on the boys there. The newspapers in some of the towns in northern Indiana were outspoken in their opinion before the war that the nation shouldn't go to war over slavery. Let the states decide what social institutions will be allowed within the state's border. Hadn't the Missouri Compromise settled that anyway? Some states could go free, some would be slave. The sentiment for letting the slave states settle their own troubles had vocal opposition. Of course, they said the nation couldn't survive half slave, half free. The southern states could not leave, breaking up the Union. Many of the citizens of southern and central Indiana had ancestors who fought in the Revolution, as mine did. The War of 1812, the Battle of Tippecanoe, they knew their history pretty well because they'd read it in the McGuffey Reader. The southern states, of course, grew more adamant about keeping the slaves, though they were calling it a fight for independence. Finally, when it appeared Abraham Lincoln was elected, he would not support an extension of slavery into the new states. South declared it was seceding from the United States of America. Many in Indiana rallied around the flag and organized marching clubs here and elsewhere to go to the war, and the units were departing on the trains in the early summer of 1861 for Western Virginia, as my regiment did, to heed the president's call. But many other people were frank and loud in their opposition. The split in Indiana as the war commenced was not as obvious as it would be later. It was expected the war would be over in 3 months. After the Bull Run debacle, when the northern troops were ignominiously routed, several supporters came out into the open. As the boys from my own ancestors' regiment, that 14th, were marching around the Shenandoah Valley, then the peninsula near to Richmond, and didn't win quick battles at Malvern here, Antietam, and Fredericksburg, the boys from around here headed directly south and went to Vicksburg. And while this was happening, people in the hometowns, the murmuring became a clamor. Let the states go. Blood of Hoosiers is being spilled. And what's it all about? Our grandparents and parents, some of them, grew up in the South. We should stand by our brothers. Politicians entered the fray. Peace Democrats, they were called. The war was unconstitutional because the Founding Fathers set up the nation to practice states' rights. Thus, the South was allowed to withdraw from the Union. The national government was trampling on the states, and countless young men were dying from it, especially our homeboys who otherwise would be studying at Indiana University or Wabash College, or working on the farms and attending church suppers and courting their sweethearts. Our boys are dying in a fruitless war. Behind these basic and often emotional arguments was an economic reality. The Mississippi River was a lifeline for agricultural produce in Indiana. For 3 generations, Hoosiers had shipped their corn and hogs and whetstones down the river to New Orleans and out to the world. With the rivers closed, that avenue to profit was closed, and the clamor was loud. Politicians and unhappy farmers spoke out and said, the Eastern manufacturers have seized the power and the U.S. government, and they are running this war to make money for themselves. Let's negotiate peace. In late 1862, when the men of the 14th were freezing in camp after they had lost scores of their comrades in the Battle of Fredericksburg, and while the Anderson men were on post duty in Helena, Arkansas, eventually, around that time, they were working to build the Yazoo Canal, and that was one of the most awful jobs in the Civil War, trying to bypass the Mississippi. And the mosquitoes were everywhere. Malaria was plaguing them. It was muddy. They get stuck in the mud. No place to rest. Hardly anything to eat. It was bad. In their home neighborhood, dissenters were organizing. Some stayed within the bounds of the political process and posted their own slates of peace Democrats. Others joined an organization called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, this was a secret society, a lodge which was dedicated to overthrowing the war effort. The men met in barns across the southern tier of counties, Davis, Martin, and Orange County, the one south to the Ohio, and also up north too. This was going on around Huntington and Fort Wayne, in fact, all over the state. The men met by night, wearing sheet-like uniforms and taking a loyalty oath to the Constitution and vowing to oppose the war. This is the book we have just reissued. It is the only novel, per se, of this kind on the Civil War, based on the experience of the 80th Indiana and the 14th, and the home front in Indiana. And so it's a detailed story of those, and part of the Copperhead story is told in here. This is chapter 4, May, June, 1862. Hindosson Falls, 1862, almost 40 years after the epidemic which had destroyed it as a town. Have any of you ever been down there on White River and south of Lagodi and gone to the largest ghost town in Indiana? Its cabins had retreated into the swampland of Martin County, and it was an eerie testament to the frailty of human endeavor. On a sultry night at the very end of May, while the men of the 14th were campaigning in the Shenandoah Valley, heat lightning flickered over the ruins of the town, illuminating its earth-covered foundation and the streets grown high with jimson weed and burdock. 3 figures wearing low-brimmed hats and oil coats rode up a lane toward the town, dismounted near the northern edge of the overgrown cemetery. They led their horses toward a large barn on a lonely farm, which now abutted the old town property. The tallest of the trio spoke in a low tone to the others. Meetings at 9 were a half-hour late. If the road hadn't been so damned awful out of town. They don't keep it up, his short, stumpy companion answered. Nobody comes out here no more except to go to the old mill. Perfect spot for a gathering of witches on All Hallows Eve. He began to laugh. Shut up, you fool. We're running enough risk, the other man said. You don't know what's about. You got no business asking so many questions in that store in Lagodi. I thought that man, Brooks was his name, was curious about us. And this is, of course, where they did meet. And what they did do, what were they doing? Their actual rigmarole is there's still a couple books in the Indiana State Library. My God, this is a book on the printed out your obligation in the Knights of the Golden Circle. You came in and if you wanted to join, you had to take this oath. I, within the precincts of this, do now freely renew the vows plighted in my progress thither. I also solemnly swear I will faithfully keep secret every word that I may hear, and will never by speech, sign, or intimation reveal anything which I may see, within or without, pertaining to the same, unless to a true knight, that I will never explain or exhibit any of the signs, hails, passwords, watchwords, emblems, insignia. I further swear that if I become a true knight, I will, of all places, to the utmost of my ability, respect and obey the orders. And there's more stuff about the Constitution, about swearing to that, about trying to end the tyranny that was going on, according to them. As the months unfolded and the grim statistics came in, the knights and their comrades grew more open in their hostility and opposition. They helped smuggle contraband, urged resistance to the draft, helped deserters escape, and hired lawyers to get soldiers out of their contracts. Now remember, all of these soldiers, the ones that joined the first of the war, signed a contract. They went in as volunteers, so that if you could break your contract, you could get out without deserting. And this lawyer in Indianapolis claimed that he had helped 500 enlisted men get out of their enlistment contracts. And the volunteers were left, and I think that's a disgraceful thing. I can imagine when they went back to their hometowns, it wasn't to a very good welcome. Well, most of the majority of the men stayed, of course, and toughed it out or were discharged because they were seriously ill or wounded. Some just were deserted. They were tracked down if they could find them, and they usually could. But a certain percentage, as the war wore on, chucked it all. Bravery out the window, and they were torn as their home folks couldn't cope. Marriages were collapsing. Unfortunate children were dying from fever, and they were without their fathers. So the lawyers litigated the contracts, and the Knights of the Golden Circles agitated everybody to try to get the war ended or to get the men to leave. The draft was instituted in 1862, and that's really what brought them out of the barns and into the roadways of Indiana. Knight circles came out of hiding to race through the countryside pursuing the recruiters who were deployed in the home counties to sign up more men. And at least one instance in Davis County, a recruiter was murdered by night, and I have that incident in here as one of the men who had returned from the Battle of Perryville was killed when he went out to try to stop the Knights from getting this recruiter. So there was a split in all the counties of Indiana. Many supported the war, soldiers and their families, patriotic citizens. And then there were the people who wanted the war to stop no matter what. Well, there's also been a split, interestingly enough, among historians about how influential and important the Copperheads really were. Was there really a strong opposition? Were the Copperheads really agitating, dangerous, and even killing people? Or was this just a political scheme trumped up by Governor Morton near the end of the war to try to influence the state politically? It's interesting because we call some of these historians revisionists who believe that it was all a cooked-up thing and then there really weren't any Copperheads. As a man named Frank Clement, you may have read his book in the 1980s, I did, they are the ones that said it was really not what people have drummed it up, that it was a fake enemy that was thought up by Morton and his cohorts. Now, I've traveled around through Indiana this year. I've made a lot of talks about the close of the war, and I've been surprised when I go into towns and they know what I'm going to be talking about, how older citizens, some of them in their 80s and 90s, and it's wonderful to see these people coming in, bring articles from scrapbooks that they have and library accounts that they've kept around their families about Copperhead incidents. I think one of the best places was Sullivan, Indiana, which was a hotbed, yes, of Copperhead activity, and talked articles about picnics where they got to arguing among part of the people from the church picnic and the other part, the supporters, and they had sons in the war, and everybody started scuffling, fighting, and eventually shots were fired. Now you may think, well, this has never gotten recorded. That's what's interesting to me. A lot of these incidents, we do have recorded people, of people getting shot. One was at least one in Sullivan County. There must have been 10 recorded, but there were others that never got recorded, these murders on the roads and people fighting and shooting each other. Some of it was, I won't say bordered on humorous, but you can imagine small towns getting agitated, and then they didn't have confrontations that hurt anybody. You know where Clarksville is up the road here. A lot of you pass through Clarksville when you come out of Noblesville. Clarksville looks today about like it did then. There's the Baptist church over here and the Christian church down over there, founded in 1867, but getting together and meeting in another church. And in Clarksville, they had the Indiana Legion, and that's one of our books, which I didn't bring. The 20,000 Hoosiers, men who stayed back and were the Indiana Legion to defend the hometown, and they marched, and they got their guns, and they were responsible for getting their own uniforms, and they marched around, and they were young boys or old men, and they had to listen to their fellow farmers and fellow church members bossing them around, and the records in the Indiana State Library tell you all about how the poor captains are having a lot of trouble because nobody will listen to what they say. Well, there was a unit of the Indiana Legion there in Clarksville, and they had not been called out for anything. I don't even remember whether they went when Morgan the Raider came out. Anyway, the Clarksville Legion unit received word that Copperheads were agitating and shooting guns in Noblesville. The boys went into the town armory there at Clarksville, broke into it, seized the rifles, and headed for Noblesville, Copperhead country, namely the back lot of a man named Tobin. There they all scuffled around, fired some shots, and broke up the agitators, and the Copperhead scurried for home. The captain wrote to Morton complaining he could not find the seized rifles and that the men were pretty insubordinate. He had also, they had to account for them. If those rifles were gone, they had to pay for them. So he was pretty upset that the guys had broken in there before he could even get over. They were his neighbors and fellow church members, and that was the way a lot of it went. But it was often far more serious. For some time, those of us have had to live in the midst of the letters, newspaper articles of the Civil War, like a lot of you do, and followed its local history, knew that Clemens and the revisionists were not right, that I don't rank myself among the in-depth historians about Copperheadism. I don't believe that story has been written, really. I believe Steve Town, former state archivist and now an assistant archivist at IUPUI, is the expert on this. He settled the case in a recent Indiana History Magazine article from Indiana University. He shows in this thoughtful, lengthy article about the leading peace Democrats, he centers Landrum Milligan of Huntington, Indiana out and describes his career and his activity during the war in detail. The press loved to write articles in these small town papers and the bigger ones about the Copperheads. Here, and they put copies of some of the ritual, which you saw was supposed to be super secret. Well, of course, it never was, exactly. Here, this was sung to my country, 'tis of thee. God save our wretched land from Lincoln's traitor band, from woe and blight. Make all our people brave, arise our homes to save in freedom's night. So men rode through the streets of Centerville, Indiana, shouting, hurrah, Jefferson Davis. When the Ohio Copperhead leader Clement Vallandigham was to speak at the State House lawn in Indianapolis just after Chancellorsville, an organized effort put guns in the hands of many ruffian protesters. An attempt was made on Governor Morton's life. So this was serious, really. Soldiers boarded the train on which the agitators were riding with their guns and confiscated the weapons, and I tell that story in here too, and arrested people. It was called the Battle of Pogue's Run. Was there any chance of an armed uprising to change the course of the war? Surely not, but that didn't minimize the kind of chaos such a large and clamorous effort caused to the war effort. It's probably best to prove this strongly stated argument, personalize the story of the war's opposition, by looking at the careers of two war Democrats, one from southern Indiana and one from Huntington. They were both defendants in one of the most famous cases in American legal history, the landmark case Ex parte Milligan, which ruled upon treason trials flowing out of the Copperhead movement in Indiana at the end of the war. This was serious stuff. One of the defendants was the notorious, self-avowed Copperhead, William Augustus Bowles. Now, Bowles is one of the most interesting characters in Indiana frontier history, and some of you are from, I heard a couple like Orange County history. Well, Bowles was from Orange County. It's clear he had two different parts to his personality. He was a state developer, leader, entrepreneurial planner, also failed profiteer and disloyal agitator who died ignominiously and was buried in an unmarked grave. I'm going to talk about these people in a little detail because I think it helps you to understand just what this sentiment was and who was involved in it. Born in Maryland in 1795, Bowles came to Indiana with his family to make his fortune on the frontier, and he was a doctor. He published Paoli's first newspaper and was a Baptist minister, a post in which he irritated his parishioners by giving an avant-garde view of what Baptists should be. A friend of his described Bowles as eccentric, huge in stature for the times, handsome, beguiling in his speech, and powerful in his ability to influence others. As a physician, he was convicted of grave robbing, sold drugs, and probably took them himself, and got into trouble by setting up his own bank, issuing paper notes, unsecured and difficult to redeem. His enterprise folded, and he involved himself in Democratic politics. Early in the 1840s, Bowles built the first hotel in French Lick. That's the French Lick Hotel. When he served in the war with Mexico, he eventually had command of Company B, his unit in Mexico, and action began. He was reported by a soldier riding home to have gotten off his horse and hidden behind it. Then he ordered retreat, and his volunteers literally ran from the field with no orders as to where to stop. It may have been he misread his superior's orders, but this retreat followed him all of his life. In the Mexican War, he became friends with Jefferson Davis of the 1st Mississippi Volunteers, and that friendship endured. He went off to run for office and support land development. He platted the original town of French Lick and developed the hotel as a spa. He also was arrested for bringing a Negro woman into Orange County. There's a lot in that Orange County book about Bowles. The first chapter of the Knights was introduced by Bowles at his hotel. During Morgan's raid, Captain Thomas Hines stopped at Bowles' house first, expecting the uprising Bowles had been talking about. All of southern Indiana, all of the state would rise to stop the war. Of course, it didn't happen. Those farmers weren't going to do that. In 1864, the year we've arrived at earlier, Morgan and his agents were circulating in southern Indiana, getting information about the Knights of the Golden Circles, and Bowles was in their spyglass. There was evidence of a real conspiracy to foment an uprising in Indiana and Illinois and let the prisoners out of Camp Douglas and Morton, spurred on by the Knights and their leaders. The plan was to free prisoners at Camp Morton in Indianapolis and Douglas, and everybody would join it. Governor Morton arrived at a decision with his military subordinates, and in close consultation with Lincoln, approved to arrest the conspirators as traitors. That's the case that went national and has often been regarded as a landmark in jurisprudence. Let's talk a little bit about Landrum Milligan, who was another defendant. Milligan was a brusque, smart lawyer from Huntington, Indiana, another hotbed of opposition. He ran several times for all kinds of political office, and he never could win. His abrasive, ranting personality probably contributed to this. In addition, war Democrats, moderates in the party, did not really want to hear talk of armed insurrection, which Milligan came to espouse. He traveled throughout the state addressing crowds and doing newspaper interviews during 63 and 64, when the war dragged on and people were discouraged about the prospects of victory for the North. He didn't stop at political solutions, though. He was frank to say and stated when a tyrannical king figure like Abraham Lincoln was dictating life from Washington, when Morton spies were ever on the watch, personal liberty was threatened. At a speech in Fort Wayne, just after an unsuccessful bid for the governor's spot, and speaking from the balcony of a Fort Wayne hotel, this is what he said. No nation that has once been free and surrendered her liberties ever was known to regain them again. Then I exhort you to prepare for the crisis, not by secret organizations, but conscious of a rectitude of purpose, go at it boldly and in open daylight, emblazon it on your banners, let liberty be your watchword, let it resound from every stump in Indiana. A free election, a free fight. Organize, arm ourselves with pikes and scythes, long guns, short guns. Arm yourself as best you can. Some must need perish in the conflict, but I, for one, would rather be snuffed out in the blaze of a glorious struggle for right than flicker a little longer with the scintillations of expiring liberty. Give me liberty or give me death. Somehow it's not quite the same thing to me. There were some speeches like this in Vincennes and probably around here too, but not quite so strong. Most talking was still done in the barns by Torchlight. Uprising for freedom? Coming battle in the state? Some must perish in the fight? Scythes and pikes? Didn't sound very realistic to most of the listeners even if they had been Knights of the Golden Circle. Grumbling and cursing, most of them went back to harvesting the corn, which was ripe right about then. The government was serious about arresting traitors who spoke of a great uprising with the conniving with the agents of the Confederacy. Evidence was taken, more evidence gathered, were at the points where the arrests were made. Bowles and Milligan and 2 other men were prosecuted and tried by a military commission. On October 21st, 1864, the trial commenced. Full details are in that book, Casinos, Copperheads, Pioneers, and Politicians, by the late author Arthur Dillard of Orange County. Bowles and Milligan were found guilty, incarcerated in deplorable circumstances until they could be executed. But the war was ending at this time and Lincoln was assassinated. President Johnson postponed the execution of Bowles and Milligan, and they appealed to the Supreme Court. In that famous case, Ex parte Milligan, the court decided in a few months that they had been tried by the wrong court, a military tribunal. There were civilian courts extant in the state at that time, the decision stated, and these should have been used. The 2 men were eventually released. Both went on to checkered careers, with Milligan eventually making quite a bit of money as a lawyer and land developer up here, and continuing to run unsuccessfully for office. Bowles' wife Eliza, who had recently divorced him, died in 1870 in the blow-up of the steamboat Emma. He remarried again, involved in disputes, odd and shady seeming happenings until his death in 73, and the world went forward. As we look back at the Copperhead controversy on this ending the sesquicentennial, we ask ourselves what we should take, if anything, lasting from this contentious but ultimately loyal home front struggle in the Civil War. And I'd like to suggest a few things to you. These partisan bickering, sometimes desperate fights, as in 1864, have been with America a long time. Our processes, however faltering, seem to work through them in this democracy. Maybe we can remember that when we look at the far right, the far left, and realize that eventually the middle usually finds a way to surface to heal and help the problems. Number 2, I don't have to tell this group that we need to remember the price the nation paid for the Civil War. Civilian families split by political opinions, hatreds, suffering, the fruit of the frontier, 800,000 of them, they now think. The new nation, the young men of the new nation, dead of disease and battle. They brought us a new age, the recreation of a nation forever unified and free of the scourge of slavery, ready to lead the world with their lives and futures. Now, I want to tell you that I want to remember the conflicts of the U.S. I want to recall 9/11 and not forget it, 3,000 dead. But I truly never, ever want to forget the conflict that tore us apart as a nation, wrought the future with these young men's lives and the shattered lives of the people left behind. They would never come back to the hills and valleys of home again. In Indiana, 24,465 men died fighting for the North. 50,000 Hoosiers were wounded, many permanently. 3, I think all of us in Indiana realize that the issues these people fought over don't solve themselves easily. We have not arrived at all at the equality of opportunity for everybody that we're capable of offering. We're always having to defend the freedom of individuals against encroaching and too powerful government, as Milligan actually said. Some of these issues are alive and well today, and actually, if you listen to some of the stuff they were talking about, you can see that that's how the government grew, was during the Civil War. So be aware. About this, he was right. About everything else, he was wrong. The wrong man with the wrong message and means at the wrong time. He was wrong. God give us the wisdom to sort out what are the right issues, the right means for the right time, and the temperance to sort them out without warring in one way or another. These struggles are agonizing, like tearing a person's body apart. And as we look at ISIS today and figure out what in the world to do about it, we need to remember how wrenching and horrible war really is. And those of us who have been interested in it, I try not to romanticize it too much and remember what it really, truly was. I try to have a balanced attitude about the Civil War. How my relations fighting in the 14th Regiment from Vincennes and Lagodi hated the Copperheads. I have to agree with them. Their arguments seem so ridiculous, so divisive, so unnecessarily destructive. But working with papers and opinions in Orange County, you do have to sometimes listen to the other guys to see what it is that they are saying so that you can marshal your own arguments and really understand what they're about. They wanted us to stop and see how far the federal government should go. It's the same old fights. Some of these things are still alive today. How far should the government go is a question we all want to know. It is the question of the future, so some of the fire in the rear is still burning us today or merely warming our discussions. The message of the fighting generation, which we are honoring this week in Anderson, and which has been honored over the last 4 years in the sesquicentennial, when they were returning from the way in 1864, is one for us to think about. What would those boys have wanted us to say? What would they have wanted us to think and do? Mostly, here's what they would want. Let us restore the Civil War monuments all over Indiana, as some towns are doing. Let us restore in our hearts the historical knowledge of the period and the issues that shaped it. Let's dedicate ourselves anew to the freedom they fought for and the unity of this nation. You are all doing it every month and through many years, and we can thank you sincerely for doing that. As the veterans used to say at their reunions, here's to the spirit of 61 to 65. Anderson Civil War Roundtable, I personally thank you. Okay.